Our first speaker is an authority, and I had no idea how important he was until we had an informal discussion over breakfast this morning, and I'll tell you why. I wrote a chapter now let me say this now, I rarely ever bring my books to presentations because they sell quite well. I don't need to push them. But I have brought this book because it's very, very pertinent. It's a book by myself and a colleague who's a professor of financial crime from Norway on corruption. I had no idea that Afra Raymond, who's our next speaker, plays such an important role in a chapter which I cover in the book about the Uticot investigation in Trinidad and Tobago, which constitutes one of the biggest scandals where financial crime, corruption, you name it, it took place. And Afra Raymond was one of the main people in terms of providing evidence, and I think he was on the stand for days, providing expert evidence during that proceedings. So on that basis alone, he's a very, very important person in terms of his understanding of the use and the abuse of procurement procedures. And we know the importance of procurement procedures in terms of the efficient, the equitable, and the legal distribution of public resources. Afra is the professional fellow of the RIC and the managing director of Raymond Peer Limited. He's a well-known public figure in terms of an expert opinion on news, a broadcaster, and in journalist articles. A very important person, both from Trinidad and Tobago, but I think throughout the region. So please put your hand together and welcome Mr. Afra Raymond, please.
Good morning, and thanks to the Oil and Gas Association and the Caribbean Institute of Forensic Accounting for inviting me. This is a really important proceedings today. And I'm really encouraged that Guyana, as a country, is taking this moment very seriously, the moment before the arrival of the oil and gas money. And before I get into the slides, this is the first slide here. I want to set the table, which is the language you use in ADR, as to what I'm going to talk about and what it means. And I want to start off by saying that the target of my discussion is corruption and nepotism. It's a very serious thing. Occasionally I'll put in a little bit of humor, because that's the way we do it in Trinidad and Tobago. When it's very, very serious, we make a really bad joke. So in Trinidad and Tobago, we say there's 5 Fs. At least I coined these phrases, there's 5 Fs. And the 5 Fs are, in these improper situations, these criminal situations, friends, family, and financiers find favor. Friends, family, and financiers find favor. And we have to recognize that it's a crime. The same way that rape is a crime, and murder is a crime. I think this morning's headline, Dr. Perry spoke about it. There's a minister, I think it's the Minister of Public Safety, you all call it. And the minister is perturbed. Why are they educated criminals? Was he talking about corrupt officials? He was talking about fellas who went with a gun to rob a bank. Now, neither one is correct, but my focus is on corruption. And we must remember the 5 Fs. What we need to get clear is the scale of the losses. Coming from Trinidad and Tobago, and one of the paradoxes in the whole anti-corruption movement and the whole question of corruption scholarship and procurement scholarship is how, and I'm a surveyor, surveying is the science of measurement. I'm a professional surveyor. Surveying is the science of measurement. How do we know how much money was lost in corruption? How do we know that Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index for this country or that country is correct? How do we reconcile the high ranking of certain countries where absolutely corrupt practices are normalized? So, for example, in the USA, lobbying is legal, which means the United States legislature, the body that forms laws in the states, is virtually in the hands of the pharmaceutical companies, the military industrial complex, and a whole lot of the financial companies and so on. but it's not corrupt because it's legal. And I'm going to deal with that wrinkle, and it's a big wrinkle, in dealing with our Caribbean story here, and particularly what has happened in Guyana and lessons from Trinidad and Tobago. So we have this difficulty measuring corruption because the person giving the bribe and the person taking the bribe are never going to talk about it unless they fall out. Or there's a switch in office from this political party to that political party, and I guess you all know what I'm talking about. So somebody will find the files and so on and so on. In Trinidad and Tobago, we had a situation with a vast amount of wealth that flowed through our country. And I think it was Prime Minister George Chambers, the chap who followed Eric Williams upon his death in 81. George Chambers gave a budget speech, I think it was in about 84. And George Chambers was speaking to something that at that time, the phrase we used is the petrodollar to describe the money that the country had made from oil. And George Chambers said, out of the petrodollars that had flowed through Trinidad and Tobago, 2 out of every 3 petrodollars had been stolen or wasted. That's how serious it is. So people who think corruption is a small thing, it's 10%, it's 5%, it's a little thing. It is no little thing. It is huge. They are taking the best parts, they're taking the meat, and they're leaving for the public the bone. 2 out of $3 was stolen or lost, wasted. And I have some colleagues here, I'm seeing colleagues from the Ministry of Education in Guyana, and I know there are people concerned with the whole question of public education and discourse around corruption. So it's important that we understand the importance of education. Education is very important. And I'm not talking about certification, in that I have an RICS and you have an ACCA and you have an LLB. I'm talking about education, understanding what it is we're talking about.
Not just the thing, but the nature of the thing, the meaning of the thing.
And the impact of corruption on young people. In a society that is very, very corrupt, and there's a lot of nepotism, you can have a situation where, in fact, young people, bright people, qualified people, don't want to stay. And they don't want to stay because being young and bright and qualified is not enough to get a good job or to get a good opportunity. You have to do other things. You have to sleep with somebody. I'm saying it like it is. You have to do stupidness. You have to be prepared to sign stupidness. And the young, bright, qualified people that we have raised, because it's our generation, they're not putting up with that. So they need for their papers to go and live in Canada, and to go and live in England, and go and live in the States. And all the money that we spent inoculating and educating and preparing those young people for leadership in this society is a waste. Because the first chance they get, it's on a plane they will get. And the reason is because this society is corrupt. So corruption has a lot of what economists call externalities. It's not just a question of measuring how much money this contractor stole when they were building that bridge. If that contractor will only hire corrupt engineers, and the ministry itself will only promote corrupt engineers, and your son did engineering, and he gets a chance, he's not going to stay. He's going to go. And that is the impact on our region. We need to be very clear about it. So I'm going to spend a little time setting this table. There's also the phenomena where we have a shortfall in terms of infrastructure and national development. There's also a phenomena of impatience, and it's a human thing. And the whole feeling being one of progress at any cost. So there might be a bridge from here to there, and there's a big discussion and a debate about whether the bridge costs too much, whether the contract went to the right person, yes? Whether there were any cost overruns, whether the minister should really have been involved in this meeting or that meeting, and that kind of thing. And at the background, in between all of us writing articles, and some of us may have official positions and taking positions, in the background, the public is murmuring, but I don't care. Because the old bridge was really, it was too old. And we needed a new bridge. And we needed a new school. So there's that degree of impatience. And one of the phenomena we don't speak about in the anti-corruption work very much is the whole question of progress at any cost. So people say that they said, I don't care how much it costs. We have a new bridge now. I don't care if the Chinese built it. Or I don't care whether the last government are the ones who, we have a new bridge. My children are going to a new school. So there's a whole phenomenon of progress at any cost. And then there's the question of why is white-collar crime so prevalent? And white-collar crime is so prevalent because it's really a kind of a dream scene. A dream scene. So you have an activity that in fact has extremely high rates of return. Extremely low to zero chance of ever being caught or identified even. And almost nobody ever goes to prison. We're talking about reality here. So you could, if you have the money, you could spend $5 million and give it to a political party. Because elections coming, right? You give them $5 million. They came to ask you for something, you give them $5 million. And they could see for you. As we say in Trinidad, A for apple, B for butter, and they see for themselves. They could see for you. And give you a $50 million contract when they get inside. And nobody will ever come by you, no police will ever come by you. That is the kind of law enforcement systems we have down here, and that's the kind of law enforcement systems we have to change and understand why it's so prevalent. Perry started speaking earlier on about the prevalence of white-collar crime, and it reminded me of a scene, one of my favorite, in fact my favorite scene from the movie The Godfather with the mafia back in the 70s. And the Godfather, Mario Puzo, is sitting down in his study, and this young Irish guy who was going off to study law was about 18 or 19, and he was nervous because he was afraid the family was sending him to study law. I think he was going to Yale. He was going to, I hope nobody here went to Yale, but he was going to go to study law at Yale. And the Godfather and him are talking, a heart to heart. And he's saying to the Godfather, you know, I don't want to leave the family, and I got all my exams done, and I'm going to go and do law, and I want to be part of the family business. And he was virtually in tears. And the Godfather just patted him and said, son, listen to me. I've been looking at the way things are going in America. And the way things in America are right now, one man, one lawyer with a briefcase could rob more money in a day than 100 millions with shotguns. So I want you to go to Yale Law School and learn everything they're doing up in there. Whatever they're doing up in there, I want you to learn it. Because you're going to come back here and set things up for us. This is the activity of mafia. Corruption is an activity of international financial criminals and international criminal networks. It is not anybody down the road or anybody up the road. We know the people, but those people are just little agents. The real huge corruption is on that scale. The last example I will give in setting the table is that in Trinidad and Tobago we had an Piaco airport fiasco that was part of the Commission of Inquiry done by former Chief Justice Clinton Bernard, and that was led to people in the States, I think it was 4 or 5 people, being prosecuted and convicted, and they went to prison, they're back out of prison. Back in Trinidad and Tobago, the politically connected persons, I think they call them PEPs now, politically important people, yeah? Exposed, the exposed ones, but in fact they've been exposed because we have 19 years now in Trinidad. We have what we call a preliminary inquiry still going on. Preliminary. So 1.6 billion Trinidad and Tobago dollars was spent to build that airport. And in fact our Director of Public Prosecutions revealed, I think it was in about 2012 or 2013 in a press release, that over $1 billion of that money actually got siphoned out of the project, was not used for construction, and in fact is located in countries, the names of which most of us can't pronounce. Something stan and something somewhere else and so on. And people just siphon the money out of our treasury. So again, $2 out of $3 stolen or wasted. So that's the scale of the problem. It's not a small thing, it's not a petty thing. And my focus is on grand corruption. Okay? I had a look at the Guyanese Procurement Act of 2003. And I compared that, and the Guyanese Procurement Act has been implemented through there's a National Procurement and Tenders Agency, and you have a Public Procurement Commission that was appointed in October last year. So Guyana has actually gone this step, and I want to say congratulations to the people in Guyana.
Because I know it would be a collective effort to get that far, and that's a tremendous achievement that has been done in Guyana. So I salute it. I'm very serious.
You deserve a round of applause. Serious. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have a more advanced piece of legislation, but I have to smile when I say that it's not yet implemented, but we'll get to that. So the first thing I'll say about the Guyanese Act is that it defines procurement at Section 2J as the acquisition of goods, works, and services. Okay? And it talks about the procuring entities, and the procuring entities are defined as ministries, departments, agencies, units of government. They talk about international agreements, and this is very interesting to me. So Section 4 of the 2003 Procurement Act actually, in my opinion, I mean, there are learned people here who will correct me if I'm wrong, but in my opinion, Section 4 creates a loophole in which the government can do a procurement outside of the Procurement Act. So in fact, it's what I call an engineered loophole. It's no accident, it's no oversight. Somebody sat down and decided, here what, you want a hole to pass there. So many feet high and so many, somebody engineered and made that hole, and it's there in Section 4. So in fact, a government-to-government agreement or government-to-government arrangement to construct something, like you'll have something going on at the airport and there's other things, would take place outside of the Procurement Act. Then there's contract awards, and we're told that the procurement contract is awarded to the supplier or contractor who submitted the lowest price quotation. And that's at Section 27, subsection 5. I have an issue with that, and I'll get into that in a little detail in a few minutes. That's not best practice as far as I'm concerned. It's good, it's interesting, not best practice. Cabinet review. There's also an interesting provision here that the Cabinet has the right to review all procurements above $15 million threshold. $15 million is relatively low in terms of what the exchange rate is and so on. And I also find that to be interesting because in Trinidad and Tobago, the political atmosphere is such that we would regard it as backward if the Cabinet had the power to review procurements above a size like that. I don't see, but I mean, Guyana is a different political space. I don't see why the political directorate should get that involved in what is effectively an operational decision. But that's just an opinion, we'll discuss it later, okay? And, sorry, I'll repeat there. And then this is some criticisms of the Guyanese Act overall. So the first criticism is that it has got very limited scope. And the limited scope is because the Act, as I said in my first slide, only refers to goods, works, and services. Okay, and there's a lot more on the table in terms of what's taking place in procurement and the transactions in public money. Secondly, at Section 4, it excludes government-to-government agreements. And that is detrimental because, I mean, there was one time in Trinidad, again about 2013, I performed an analysis, and I think maybe 60 to 70% of the large-scale projects taking place in the country were government-to-government. And our Central Tenders Board Act also excludes government-to-government arrangements. So you have a situation where an administration can pass a law that is commendable in terms of transparency and good governance, and then make an amendment to the law, which is what happened in Trinidad in 1979 with Section 20, subsection 1 of the Central Tenders Board Act. And they created 5 exceptions to the Central Tenders Board Act. And the 5 exceptions are really interesting. The 5 exceptions were emergencies, the good old national security, wink wink. Number 3 was state enterprises. Number 4 was NIPDEC, which is a development company within the National Insurance Fund. And number 5 was government-to-government arrangements. So you have a Central Tenders Board Act, and you have a Central Tenders Board that's funded and set up and staffed and so on. And then you create these 5 exceptions, and you do everything through there, except for manhole covers and to paint the doors of schools and little small inconsequential things. So we have to be serious and understand that universal coverage has to mean universal coverage. Otherwise, it's nonsense. It's also silent, the Guyanese Procurement Act. I wasn't able to see any sections in the Act or the regulations or the amended regulations that dealt with performance data, or what in construction we call outturn costs. And you have to look at outturn costs to get an idea of performance. It's no good saying to me that you were going to build a school over there, and you put the thing, you invited tenders, and the tenders that you received, the tender that you accepted was 10% less than the estimate, and you gave it to that contractor, and you're very pleased, and you turn the sod, and we shake hands. And a year and a half later, we come back and we cut the ribbon, and everybody's very, very happy. As a surveyor, as a professional, I want to know, is there a difference in between the cost of the outset and the cost of the end? And there's something that surveyors call an adjusted outturn cost, which is a little bit involved for this discussion, but in fact is a way to calculate what the building or the construction project actually cost, as opposed to the cost that's written in the contract. And where there have been variances, why did the variances occur? Onto whose account? Whether it was the client asked for something to change, in other words the state, and you had to pay more money because you requested a change, or was it something the contractor didn't smart, and the contractor had to change it, which was to their account, and so on and so on. So we have an adjusted outturn cost that we need to get a proper conception about these projects. The cabinet review difficulty I mentioned. The question about awards on cost, which I said I was critical of, which is at section 27, I think subsection 5, is that the awards on cost, where you say you're making an award based on the lowest cost, it works in a simple tendering situation. So if you said, for example, that you wanted to get someone to supply 200 of these tables, the tables we're sitting at today, and it's a particular table that has legs of a particular thickness, made of a particular metal, and a surface of a particular size, and so on and so on. It's pretty simple, and I think you could make a good case that in that sort of example, the cheapest person, the person making the cheapest offer, should get the contract. That's pretty straightforward. But what about if it's more complicated? What about if it's a design-build situation? You say we have to shift our thinking from the 2003 model to what's happening now. Design-build model is a very popular model now. So the government may want to put up 6 health centers for public health. And they may just conceptually have identified 6 parcels of land in different parts of the country. They may have an idea from their own research about how big those buildings should be and what rooms should be in them. So they say we want 6 health centers of so many square meters in size, so big as the waiting area, so big as the consulting area, so many toilets, it should be air conditioned, water storage of this much, and you give a kind of a specification generally for the building, but not a design. So you then issue an invitation for design build proposals. Now each designer could come up with a different approach to hit that target, and they have to be analyzed in three matrices. The first matrix is the financial stability of the person making the proposal. Is that somebody, and the ethical record and so on, is that somebody that you want to give a $100 million contract? Or is that somebody who's going to disappear with $100 million? Or use the money to pay some other debt that they had? These are real questions in the world of contracting. So you carry out a financial test of the person. Secondly, you do a technical test of the proposal. Yes, the proposal could tick all the boxes in terms of size and the number of rooms and the number of bathrooms and all of that. But how durable is the building? Because this is not commercial construction, where I could be a contractor building this building for the owners of this hotel, and when it's over, they hand me my final check and I hand them the keys, and they have to maintain it for 50 years. In the case of the government building 6 health centers, you have to maintain it for 50 years. So you have to be cognizant of the cost of repairs and maintenance going forward. And there are different ways. Was that for me? Sorry. There are different ways that in fact you can construct a building of a certain size with those bathrooms and rooms inside of it. And those buildings have different performances. So for example, I'll give an example. In Trinidad and Tobago, we built a huge waste health project, the biggest one in Trinidad and Tobago, said to be the biggest in the Caribbean, at Mount Hope, with some French contractors. It was another lovely government-to-government arrangement back in the oil boom in the 70s and the 80s. And Mount Hope has a couple of scandalous elements about it. One of them was that, in fact, I think it said that up to now, it was completed in about 82, 83, yeah? Up to now, over half of the space in that complex has never been used. So we have to deal with a fundamental issue like needs assessment. Why do we need to do these projects? Over half of the buildings in there have never been used. No patients have ever been treated, no babies, no ladies have delivered babies, nothing. They're just locked up. Total waste of money. But the point I'm getting to in terms of the technical specification is that there are elements in the Mount buildings which are built using a largely prefab technology. There are elements in the Mount buildings that up to now, although the contractor took advantage, we have to go back to that contractor to get parts. You see? Whereas there are more simple forms of construction that when it's over and you pay the person off and something goes wrong, any workman could fix it. Any plumber could fix this, any electrician could fix that. And there are other forms of construction where it is deliberately designed that only they could fix it. Just like some expensive cars and so on. Okay? So the three forms of testing, the tenders, would be the financial stability of the proposer, the technical implications of the proposal, in other words, the design, and then thirdly, only at the end of that do you come to the point of comparing costs. But you prepare a matrix, an assessment matrix, to decide who gets the project. This approach that is in the Guyanese law, which is section 27, subsection 5, is in fact, in my opinion, it's sound only to a point, very limited. If you're dealing with more complicated procurements, it's not going to serve the public interest very well. So you need to have a review, a rethink on that law to take account of some of the points that I'm making. And then, of course, the modern procurement approaches, which I mentioned here, are ignored. So public-private partnerships.
Bold. I just spoke about design build. Those things are not really fitting within the, at least from what I can see, within the 2003 Act. The next thing I want to talk about is the Trinidad and Tobago approach.
So first of all, I know that some of you have been involved in this sort of activity, and we in Trinidad and Tobago had a private sector civil society group. We had a group made up of the Joint Consultative Council for the construction industry, of which I was president. We had the Trinidad and Tobago Manufacturers Association. We had the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Commerce. We had the Transparency Institute of Trinidad and Tobago. We had the trade union movement, which is the Federation of Independent Trade Unions and NGOs. And we had a whole network of people. We had the local content chamber. We had a whole network of people stretching across industries, all the way from the left, all the way to the right, who had an understanding that we wanted to do this procurement law. And it's interesting to pause here and reflect on the types of civil society organizations. There's one type of civil society organization which is comprised, and I'm not going to call the names of those ones, which is comprised mostly of retired or semi-retired people who are do-gooders, people who genuinely want to see an improvement in the country, and who are prepared, and you could call them a little bit idealistic. They want the country to progress and so on. And the difficulty of that kind of group is that the people are not practitioners. They're out of touch, they're retired. And effectively things could be happening right in front of them and they wouldn't see it. They wouldn't really understand what it is they're seeing. And then there are other groups, like bar associations, like the JCC, which I was president of. There are other groups that are actually comprised of leading practitioners. And believe me, we could make out something. Once somebody, a minister, mentioned something, you say, oh yes, they really mean to do that. And it is good to have a round table where those different types of groups sit together. So I know some stages towards that have started in Guyana, and that's good. So I know it's difficult, keep up that part of it. The second important thing we did in terms of how we approach this task is that we decided to follow the American aphorism and follow the money. Because the only reason any of this takes place simply is because people want to get their hand on public money. In our language, where the rubber hits the road in corruption is public procurement. And when a contract is being created, or conceived. Therefore, public money is very, very important. So we went to Lord Sharman's report of 2001. Lord Sharman is a member of the House of Lords of the UK. And Lord Sharman, those of you in the audience who are accountants and some of the attorneys would know about Sharman's work. And he prepared a very important report in 2001 with his team called Holding to Account. And what was happening in that period coming up to 2001 was that there was a whole lot of corruption, scandals and crises in the UK, which is a kind of perennial thing. And the political administration appointed Sharman and a team to look at the whole question of public money. What is it? How do we account for it? How do we control it? What is the model of how we should deal with it? And this report, for those of you who haven't heard of it and who have an interest in this field, is a very, very, it's probably the leading report on this question. Very, very important to read. And some of the points Sharman makes about public money are very, very instructive. So I'm going to spend some time talking about Sharman. I want to get the concepts right. One of the points he makes about public money, and the UK was just like Trinidad, like some of these Caribbean places where you have lots of ministries, you have lots of state agencies, you have lots of situations, public-private partnerships. In the US, in the UK, they call them PFI, private finance initiatives. A lot of different where public money is going in, public land is involved, and public services ought to be emerging out of the system. How do you ensure accountability? Does the Freedom of Information Act apply to them, and all of that kind of thing? And Sharman made the first point, very fertile point, that in fact, public money is different from private money because it's extracted by coercion. You see, private money, if you decide to buy a particular jacket, this gentleman here, because that is your choice, you decide you want to buy that jacket and not any of these ones, you have chosen to give your money to the people who make that jacket. Or you decide to buy this type of watch and not that type of watch. This is part of the transaction in the private market. But when you are living in Guyana or Trinidad and Tobago or the UK, you don't have a choice. You have to pay taxes. So the state is extracting from you by means of it's coercive, and I'm not saying it's illegal, but it's coercive because you do not have a choice. The state is extracting from you by means of VAT and income tax and all these sorts of things. The state is extracting from you a part of your money and putting that into the treasury. And that is what distinguishes public money from private money. It is a different species of money. There are banknotes that look the same, they are different. And if we accept that public money is different from private money, we then have to accept the conclusions of that. And the conclusions include that public money ought to be managed and accounted for to a higher standard than private money. So that needs to be a very serious piece of understanding. Public money must always be accounted for and managed to a higher standard than private money. It's not a joke thing. And what was our definition of public money? Because I mean, in the act that we wrote, they have about 12 parts to it, but I'll just break it into 3 limbs for you in terms of what is public money, so we get a clearer understanding. Let's get focused on it now. Public money is money that is due to the state. So the money that is in your pocket, so when you go to the grocery tomorrow, and that money gets transmitted as VAT into the coffers of the state, that money is public money. It's money that's due to the state. So the grocer who collected the VAT has to remit it to the state. And this is for you SARA people. That money, those X million dollars that is in the grocer's account at this instant in time, that is public money. Although within the conventions of the financial world, it is credited to the person's bank account. But that is public money. Also, public money is money that is due from the state. So if you're a contractor and you're building a building for the state and you have a bill that is certified, a certified payment for $52 million that has not been paid yet, but you are holding that certificate, that payment certificate, that is public money too. The money that is due to you. And the third category, which we sometimes forget or maneuver around, and is really interesting, and you have to get this one right, is that public money is money that, in the event of a default, the state would be liable to pay. So if you have a public-private partnership, that has incurred debt, and the state has a big stake in it, or it's a flagship project, and that public-private partnership gets into some situation of insolvency, and the state would have to step in to pay that debt, that is also public money. So public money exists in 3 dimensions, to make it simple. Another difference in our approach is that we have taken on the whole question of disposal of public property. And disposal of public property is part of our law in Trinidad and Tobago. So it's the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act. The disposal of public property is very important. We need to understand what is public property. What is it? Now, literally, public property could be the various lands, freehold and so on, that belong to the state of Guyana. So when people say a property, I have 2 properties in Boston. It could just be 2 parcels of land with houses on them. But it's a lot more than that. And this is where it has a nice link with what colleagues are talking about in this conference about oil and gas. Because public property, it would go beyond real estate. It would include mineral rights, which is oil and gas. Yes? It would include and gold, oil, gas and gold, because gold is a mineral right. A mining concession is a valuable public property if it's in an area where there's gold. It includes timber licenses. Guyana has extremely valuable hardwood. It includes timber. It includes concessions, and this is where we get into a conceptual thing now about what procurement could mean. It includes concessions like roads and bridge tolls. It includes telecommunications concessions. So you could set up a cable company, or you could set up a cell phone company, and you could use this wavelength and that wavelength. You could set up a TV station. You could do 2 TV stations. Those are valuable rights worth millions and hundreds of millions of dollars. And they have to be part of a procurement regime and part of a procurement understanding. They're not small things. That is where the millions and millions is made. And let me give it a context for you. There was a story about 2 weeks ago. It was widely reported in international financial press. It was in Forbes, it was in The Economist, and so on, where in fact they made the point that for the first time in the history of the planet, and maybe it's the first time they admitted it, but for the first time in the history of the planet, the most valuable commodity on the planet was no longer oil and gas, it was information. All of that information is passing on an information superhighway. All of that information superhighway is out of bandwidth and licenses and concessions that states granted. You getting me now? The car cannot run in space. The signal might pass in space, but legally and constitutionally, the signal is rooted in a license and a concession. And that is why it has a value, and it has to be accounted and taken proper care of in a proper procurement regime. Okay? A disposal would include things like a grant of a lease, a grant of a license, or a concession. Okay? Some other issues I would mention is that the procuring agency in Trinidad and Tobago's law is broadly defined. So we include public-private partnerships. We don't leave it to any mystery. We say that it includes that. And it also includes any company, any organization, any institution, any agency that is transacting public money. The hook of our whole act is public money. Once you deal in public money, you're under that act. It doesn't matter what you call yourself and what your registration document says. Once you are handling public money, you're under that act in a transaction. Okay? We also have as a penalty cross-disbarment, which is one of those penalties that I think the Guyanese Act mentioned some elements of disbarment. But in the Trinidad and Tobago Act, a contractor who is caught in a corrupt activity, an improper activity, offering a bribe, that kind of thing. And it's a similar approach to the SARA approach that colleagues have worked on. It's not a question requiring a prosecution or a conviction. The procurement regulator can disbar a contractor for up to 10 years from receiving any state work, which is the ultimate penalty. because in the situation in Trinidad and Tobago, 70 to 80% of the contracts are from the state. And if you have a company and you're not getting any work from the state, your company will go down. Almost nobody has a company that could exist without the state. Okay? The other thing that's important is that we have to eliminate the corporate veil. We eliminate the corporate veil because one of the phenomena we get, and we have to be clear, we have to learn from the good experiences and the bad experiences and take the best of it. What in the MBA language I call benchmarking. You have to take the best of it.
In the financial world, where there was that huge crash in 2007 and 2008, and there are still rumblings taking place through the financial world in the first world countries, and you read these terrible stories, and you read about somebody, and this company was caught in LIBOR fraud, or in this type of fraud, or CDS fraud, and they are penalized, and there's heavy penalties the companies pay. But you never hear about any of the executives having to pay a penalty. So the company will pay that. And of course the company pays it out of something magical they call reserves. So there really is very little pain. Sure. And what is happening there is that we have removed the corporate veil. And we have decided that in fact, if you are in a state agency and you are the person responsible for procurement, every state agency must have an identified person who is dealing with procurement, a biological person. Tom Smith, his driver's permit number is this much, he lives here, this is the car he drives. Tom Smith is the one who's signing everything from this ministry or from that agency. The idea that a ministry or an agency will be fined is old hat. We have to make this a question of personal responsibility. All the fines and all of the penalties in our act are custodial. In every single case, somebody is going to jail. Which is why, so it's a fine and prison. Which is why there's this tremendous obstruction to getting it implemented. And we're fighting that. We have independent regulation and dispute resolution. We have value for money, which I talked about in relation to the question of how we assess design build tenders. We have civil society participation because there's a civil society member on the board. So there's a degree of civil society involvement. And finally, we have a procurement review panel. I think the role of civil society is very important. We also need to have, the last point I want to make is a question about the role of whistleblowers. The SARA Act, and which I'm talking more about tomorrow, and the Procurement Act give a degree of protection to whistleblowers as well as in Trinidad and Tobago. But there's a big loophole that we need to be aware of. Most of the people who will be whistleblowing, and we know that any act of corruption can't really be committed between two individuals. So a public official and a powerful contractor or supplier can't really, just as two individuals, purely transact an act of corruption. In fact, research would show us when we go through case studies that every act of corruption, the grand corruption, there's 5, 6, 7, 8 people who knew about it and were involved. Public officials, secretaries, drivers, accountants. People knew when they were involved. So the question is, how do we release that information for the advancement of the public agenda? Which is why public procurement law must include whistleblowing. And the whistleblowing concern I want to raise, I said there was a loophole, is this. If you are an employee in a state establishment dealing with large-scale procurement, or you are an employee in a private establishment dealing with contracting and supplying, most of those positions of responsibility have embedded in their contract of employment a confidentiality clause, and with quite serious penalties and so on and so on. And what all of those acts is silent on, the Trinidad and Tobago Act, the current act here and so on, all those acts is silent on is the question of litigation. So they protect the person from being dismissed and all of that stuff. But that's not the danger, in my opinion. We need to include, that's not the only danger I should say, we need to include in the protections for the whistleblower, that the whistleblower, you cannot mount litigation against the whistleblower. So section 104 of the SARA Act, I think we need to look at that again, which deals with immunities, and include that amongst the immunities, that someone who has whistleblown cannot be victimized through a lawsuit by a powerful employer or a powerful politician, because when you broke this clause and they have you in court, and spending all your money. And you were just a member of staff trying to do the right thing. So I will pause there and thank you for your attention.